Here's the reading of pages 601 to 603. The Black Death. In October 1347, 10 years after the start of the Hundred Years' War, a Genoese merchant ship docked at Messina in Sicily. It had set sail from a port on the Black Sea that specialized in overland trade from China. Dying oarsmen pulled at the vessel's oars. The ill-fated ship carried not only silk and porcelain, but also a hidden, deadly cargo. When the ship docked, the townspeople of Messina were horrified at the sight of the desperately ill sailors. One after another, the sailors began to die. Terrified of catching their disease, the Sicilians drove the vessel back to sea. Historians think that before the ship left Messina, rats had scurried down the mooring ropes tied to the docks. The rats were infested with fleas that probably carried a highly contagious disease. Within weeks, people all over the island of Sicily were dying of the plague. 3 months later, the plague spread to mainland Italy. By the next year, it had reached Spain, France, and England. In 1349, an English wool shop, its crew all dead, its crew all dead, drifted ashore in Norway. The plague had reached Scandinavia. Soon the remotest villages in Europe felt its effects. The Black Death, as this plague is known, was an unpredictable killer. Some victims went to bed in seemingly perfect health and were dead by morning. Others suffered for up to a week before dying. Among the first signs of infection were black boils on the body, from which the disease got its name. Other symptoms of the Black Death included aches and chills, strained breathing, and bouts of coughing and sneezing. And then here, how the plague spread from Asia to Europe. The plague that devastated Europe began in Asia. Eager to gain treasure and a port, Mongol forces attacked the Genoese trading post of Kaffa on the Black Sea. The Mongols were ruthless in pursuit of victory. They lobbed plague-infested corpses over the city walls to spread the deadly disease. When Genoese merchants returned from Kaffa to Europe, they brought the Black Death with them. And then here's like a painting kind of showing the Black Death as well. And then here is a map showing the how it spread and when. So just check out the colors here to decide where it happened. What was the Black Death? Historians and scientists are still puzzled by how quickly the plague spread. Was the Black Death carried by fleas and rats, or was it a rapidly spreading type of pneumonia, or something else? Experts do not know for sure. They do know that the Black Death devastated Europe, killing perhaps 25 million people by the year 1400. So the death toll mounted. In the countryside, so many peasants perished that the old social order of life on the manor began to fall apart. As labor grew scarcer, peasants left their lord's land and moved to cities in search of higher wages. But the plague was even worse in the overcrowded cities, where the disease spread like wildfire. In one 5-month period alone, 96,000 people died in the Italian city-state of Florence. In London, Avignon, Paris, and other cities, the living struggled to bury so many dead. Science in the 14th century was not advanced enough to understand, much less cure, the plague. European universities had encouraged the study of theology, philosophy, and law, but knowledge of biology and natural science lagged. Scholars and doctors could not explain the plague's causes, and their medicine was powerless to stop it. In this age of faith, most people simply believed they were experiencing God's judgment on the sins of the world. By the early 1350s, the Black Death had passed its peak, but there were further outbreaks in the following decades. Estimates of Europe's dead range from a third to a half of the population. No cure was ever found, and the reason for the disappearance of Europe's worst natural disaster remains unclear. The end of an era and the start of something new. The horrible famine, wars, and plague that struck Europe in the 14th century shook the foundations of medieval society. All this misery brought great change, some of it, surprisingly, for the better. By the end of the century, the once tight grip that lords held on serfs was loosening. So many people had died that there was a shortage of laborers who could plant crops and cultivate fields. Because the peasants were needed, they could demand higher wages. Serfdom in Western Europe was on its way out. A new prosperous class of peasant farmers was on the rise. The plague wiped out many towns, but in the towns that remained, artisans often prospered. With all sorts of labor in demand, skilled craftsmen such as carpenters, stonemasons, and tailors could more easily find work. As the Black Death disappeared, European cities showed signs of new life, particularly in northern Italy. Universities, often the beating heart of these cities, continued to emphasize the study of theology and philosophy, but the plague had changed things. Scholars now wanted to know more about the physical causes of the disease. They took new interest in medicine and the natural sciences. Important works from the Muslim libraries were being translated and making their way to Europe. The writings of Aristotle and the Muslim physician Ibn Sina were translated and studied with new urgency. In Europe, something new was in the air. The Christian church was still strong. Faith was still a very important part of life for most people. The art and music of the time remained largely religious, but the calamitous 14th century was giving way to a time of new ideas, interests, and efforts. As the 15th century dawned, Europe seemed ready for a renewal, a rebirth. And that's the ending of pages 601 to 603.